Okay, welcome back everyone. Today I'll have another look at Python and Cinema 4D and how to write your own plugins. To do this, we will have a quick look at the general setup of the SDK, how to use it, where to find documentation, and generally how to find your way around in the docs. And then we'll write a small plugin that, well, I'll just show you what it does. What it does is it creates a new object. It will then read data from another object, like so. And it will then record that object's position. So if I just press play and doesn't matter, let's do this again and just move this object around. Ideally, this should have this has recorded that movement. Is this useful? I don't know, but it's definitely a good example of how to write your own object plugin and how to read data from another object and set your own keys. So this is what we're going to do. To start with, I suggest you download the documentation, which you will find on the Maxon website on Plugin Cafe. You can either use this URL or use this link here. And then what you will find is these downloads here. These three are of interest to us. Even though we just plan to use Python for the programming part, you should definitely download all three documents, because the Python documentation is a bit incomplete and in some cases plain wrong. So you always have to refer back to the C++ doc for details. And also if Cinema answers with weird error messages that you can't really understand because you did everything that the Python doc told you, and it turns out there was just a typo in there. So you really have to double check with this doc. And the coffee one you don't really have to use too often, but there are some nice examples in there. And again, it doesn't hurt to have another reference. Once you've downloaded them, you will end up with these documents. This is the coffee one. This is the C++ one. And these documents here are quite interesting, really, the introduction, and I suggest you have a quick look at them, especially also in the user interface part. It explains quite well how to create your own UIs and what files to use and all that. And then you have this Python documentation. Oops, I'm not at the start page anymore. Let me go there real quick. So this is a Python SDK. And yeah, it also has some interesting information here. The cookbook and examples are quite small, really. There's not much in there yet, but I really hope that Maxon put some effort into expanding these. Also in the SDK folder itself, in the Cinema folder, you'll have quite a lot of examples, all written in C++, unfortunately. But yeah, they do give you a good idea of how Cinema works internally and how to use certain functions, because most functions works the same way in C++ and Python. It's only the syntax that's slightly different. Right. So before we start with the programming, we should have a quick look into how these plugins are laid out on disk. So as usual, you probably know when you install a plugin, you just copy the folder into Cinema's plugin folder, and that's it. And Cinema recognizes it as a plugin and will use it the next time you start. And to do this, the plugin has to have a certain layout in its folder. So our plugin has a folder called Live Capture Now, and within we have the actual plugin source code, which is this here. It's a Python file. Usually Python files have the file extension .py, but for Cinema you have to use pyp. There's another one called pype, which is the encoded one, or encrypted rather, the encrypted version. Cinema has a facility where you can encrypt Python files because they are always plain text and unencrypted, so everyone can look into your source code. And if you don't want that, you can encrypt it with Cinema and yeah, end up with an PIPE file that other people can't read. Because as far as I'm aware, it's a one-way encryption, so you can't decrypt it again. So always keep your original source code if you do that. Other than the source code itself, you will have a resource file folder, which will contain your icon or any other types of data files that you want to use. It will contain a C4D symbols header file, which really has nothing in it, but it has to exist. So it can be basically empty. There's just a couple things in there. Let me have a quick look. I'm not even sure what's in there. I can see there's just a dummy element in there. This is all commented out, so it's just an enumeration with really nothing in it. So we're not really using it, but it has to be there, otherwise Cinema is going to complain. Then there's a description folder, which will hold the description for the user interface. So if you have a user interface, you need a header and a resource file for that. We'll look into the details of that later. Then there's the icon file. And then there's a strings folder for each language. Strings_US is the default, and you should always have that in there. This is for the English language, obviously. If you are, let's say, writing for a German customer, then you can use strings_DE and so on. But strings_US should always be in there as well. And that again has a description subfolder and a string file which contains strings in the language that you are using there. Again, we'll look into that later. So with these files set up, you can start writing your plugin. So the plugin we saw before is just this. This is really not too long. It's not much in there, but it works. So let's get started. Generally, all plugins are based on classes in this plugins module. And in our case, we want to make an object plugin. So our plugin will be based on the object data class, which again is based on the node data class. You can have different types of plugins like tag plugins, shader plugins only since R13, R12 didn't support that. Tool plugins, all kinds of stuff. So they differ in the way that they, in what kind of functionality they offer, obviously. But also they differ in the way that they have to be registered at the beginning and the kind of functions that they need. If you want to go into the details there, I suggest you look at the documentation here and especially the C++ one. For now, I really want to give you a quick overview of the workflow, how to start writing them. And I don't really want to go into the details too much. So in any case, we want to create an object data plugin. So let's have a quick look at that and at the register function for that. Because for Cinema to know that your Python file is actually a plugin, you have to register it with Cinema. So that should be the very first thing you do before you even start thinking about anything else in your plugin. So each type of plugin has its own register command. And for our object plugin, we want the register object plugin command. Now this has quite a number of parameters. And unfortunately, the object one does not come with an example. Some of the others do come with examples, like the tag one here. And you can take that as the base for your setup, especially these lines here with for the icon. Also the parameters, they're all quite similar between the different types. Just some come with one or more parameters that the others don't have. So let's look at this here and let's look how we did it in the actual source code, because I think it's probably easier to see it in real life. So when Cinema first opens your Python file, it will jump here because the name is going to be main, and it will jump here and run this part first. This is like you saw in the documentation. This is basically okay. Let's go through it line by line. We create a bitmap object based on the base bitmap class. this is how Cinema deals with image files. Then we take the path, the system of the system of the file system path of your Python file, which is this. So this is the Python file, and it's going to take the path and split it into the directory and the file name itself. Using that directory name, we add res to that directory for our resource folder. So I'll just drag that. Let me just drag the window back in here so we can see it. So we have this. Basically, when we are here in this directory, we are in this directory where this file resides. Then we add res to it, and we add icon.tif to it. And that's basically how we end up with the file name for our icon. So if your icon were somewhere else in there, you would have to build up your correct path here. And then we initialize our bitmap file with that TIFF file here, and that's going to be our icon. Then we go to the more important part, which is the actual registration of the object plugin using this command here and these parameters. First parameter is always, and with all of these plugins, is always a plugin ID, which is a unique identifier for every plugin. You get this from the Maxon site as well. So on Plugin Cafe, you click on plugin IDs. There you register, you open an account with the Plugin Cafe forum, and then you can create your own unique IDs. Every single plugin you create should have its own ID. This is necessary so that each plugin has its own namespace and doesn't interfere with another developer's plugin or other plugins of yours, for that matter. So always make sure before, that should really be the first step. Before you even start programming anything, always create a new plugin. They are free and they are unlimited, so you can have as many as you want. And if nothing ever comes out of your idea, then it doesn't really matter, then it's a dead idea. Just make sure that it's always unique. So you create one here, then you go back into your source code. In my case, I always have a global variable defined here with my plugin ID, and this is the one I got from Maxon. And this is what you feed into the function. Then you have a string here, which in our case is live capture null, which is the name of your plugin as it appears in Cinema. So this is this here. That name comes from here. And that's also how it shows up in the menus and stuff. Then under G, actually I'm not sure what G stands for. Let's have a quick look at the documentation. Doesn't really say. I'm not sure why it's called G, but in any case, this is the class that is going to be initialized when this plugin is being started. Meaning this is our main program really. That's what we want to use for our object. So in our case, this would be this main function here, which is called live capture null, and inherits from, or extends, the object data class. So that's our class, and this is the class that we put in here. Then we have a description parameter, which means, let's have a look at the folder again. Oh, where's it gone? Looks like I accidentally closed it, but yeah, in any case, let's see. Let me just quickly navigate there. There we go. Okay. So where was I? Oh yeah, the description. Let's get the source code together there. Okay, so we have the description string here, which is O live capture null. And the O just stands for object, but this is really just any string you want, as long as it's the same for both of these files. So this is where it's going to look. It's going to look in the description folder under res. This is a fixed path, you must not change that. And in there it's going to look for a header file and a resource file, and both of them have to have this name with these extensions. Then we have the type of object plugin that we want. There are several types available. Again, refer to the manual for this. So these are the different flags. In our case, we just use the basic one here. Let's say we also wanted to use this. You can have more than one flag. That's the same for all flags, really. You can just concatenate flags by using the pipe symbol and then adding this here. Always make sure that you put in C4D in front, otherwise it can't find these variables, because they are global variables that have been defined in the C4D module, and yeah, it needs that namespace. Right, but now we don't really need this here, so for us, object generator is enough. And then the icon, that's the bitmap that we find up here. So with this here, whenever you open Cinema, it will open your Python file, it will go through this function, it will see that it's a plugin, that we're going to register it as a plugin, using this here, using that icon, and so on. And whenever you actually start or click on the button, like the icon for our plugin or menu entry or whatever else you do with your plugin, or let's say you create a new tag when it's a tag plugin, it will create an instance of this class here under G. And that's what leads us here. So, as I said before, every plugin needs to, or I only said that this one here is extending the object data class, but every plugin needs to extend its plugins types base class. So you have object data here, but you also have tag data. Let's see on top. You have tag data, you have shader data, tool data, command data. These are the main types of plugins that you will create, and every single one of your plugins needs to inherit the fitting type of class from the, well, okay, that sentence didn't make any sense, but you know what I mean. So when you have a tag data plugin, you have to extend the tag data class and so on. If we have a quick look in here, the object data one, they come with certain object-specific functions, none of which we really use except the draw one in our example. But what's more important is you should first have a look at the node data example, because most of the plugins inherit from the node data. And this has some really important functions, like the init function, for example. This is being called whenever your plugin is being created by Cinema, and that's some place where you could create, let's say for example, your plugin is somehow based on the time of day. That would be the good time to create a variable based on the time of day, or any other data really. Or if you need to know, I don't know, if your plugin is different between running on a Mac system or on a Windows system, then you could now check what kind of system it is and set a variable accordingly. So basically you're initializing your plugin. Another really important one is message. You see, these are all new in R13, so I'm kind of wary to use them right now because many people are still using R12. So I'm careful with these, but the message one is really important. Oh, you can see here there's plenty of stuff going on here. What it basically means is the message function. Most of these plugins have the message function, and the message function is being called every single time anything happens in your user interface. So if someone pushes a button, a message being generated and sent out into the world, and is being called up by all these message functions of all plugins, really, not just yours. So that way you can communicate between the user interface and your code. And as you can see here, that there are plenty of different types of messages here, really. And you really need to filter them out and just go through the descriptions here. They are quite explanatory, like as it says here, the points have changed, polygons have changed. And every time a polygon has changed, for example, a message of this type is being generated. And it contains some sort of data, which, depending on the message, will be useful to react to that message. For example, this is a very important one when you have a user interface. Every time somebody presses a button, this is the type of message that's going to be generated, and it will contain as its data package, it will contain the ID of the button and the ID of the object that button belongs to. So in our case, if we have a button in our plugin and somebody pushes that button, we want to catch the message and make sure that that button that was pushed belonged to our plugin, and if it was pushed, then we want to react accordingly. So all of these here are already in the node data or object data class, but they are basically empty. They don't do anything until you override them. So they're just templates right now. And that is what we are going to do. So we create our object data class here. These two here, init is really, that's an alias for the init with the capital I that you saw before, so this is really the same. These lines here, I have to admit, I just took from the documentation, and let's say I can show you, I think it's in the object data class. Yeah, here. So it's just some cache optimization. And I trust the documentation that it's doing the right thing here. I haven't really looked into caching too much, so I'm just putting this in, and it seems to work, so fair enough. If you really want to go into the details there, I suggest you could have a look at the C++ doc. But yeah, let's just skip over it, sorry for that, and look at the more interesting stuff. Execute. Now, we're not really doing anything with our plugin. We are just reacting to outside stuff. So our execute function is just empty. Note that these parameters here, they are all coming directly from the documentation. So let's have a quick look at the doc again. The execute function was in the node data. And no, it was not. Where was it? Was it not? Oh yeah, sorry. So this is just basically copy and paste from here. So these are the parameters that the class that you inherit from object data is expecting. So you don't really have any freedom here. You always have to put it like this. And yeah, we don't really use this here. What we do use, however, is the message one, like I told you before, for the buttons. So whenever a message is coming in, we're checking whether this type of message is actually coming from a button, the message description command, like it said. Nope, that really was in the other class. So let's go back to message. Right, well, there we go. There's the message description command. And we're making sure it is one. And always make sure to put the C4D dot in front. Otherwise, this is just meaningless to Cinema or to Python. So if it's a message coming from a button, then we check in the messages data package for the information what kind of button it was. Now this here is a bit, I have to admit, a bit convoluted looking. To give you a better idea what kind of messages are flowing back and forth here, I've put some debug messages in here. So let's just do this for a test. Note that I put the str, also string command in front of all of these here, because otherwise Python will complain that it's concatenating a string type and a non-string type. So string is just taking a string representation of these of this data here and adds it to this here. So anyway, let's have a look. Oh yeah, and another thing. Notice I have now changed the source code, and in R12, if you're still using it, you now have to close Cinema and start it up again, so it's reloading the plugins. R13 luckily finally included a function to reload all the plugins, and that's really, really helpful. So yeah, I put that function here. So let's just reload. And as you can see, these are no error messages. Immediately we get output here. because every single thing you do here, everything, if I create something, if I just move around here, everything is creating messages. And as you can see here, you're basically drowning in messages. These types here, they come in as numbers. And these numbers are, well, they come from an enumeration of numbers from the SDK's header files. And that's really another thing that's quite important. If you just navigate to your Cinema folder, it has a resource subfolder, and in there you will find a bunch of files from the SDK under the API. But there will also be two really important header files. And if we look at those, I actually opened them here already. That's c4d symbols.h and coffee symbols.h. And you notice these numbers here, they are very similar to the ones we just saw in the messages. So if we take, we just remembered. So it's 100 and 1090. Let's see if we can find that here. Okay, so it's not in here. Well, so much for that. Oh. There you go. It is in here. My shortcut didn't work, sorry. In here as well? No. Alright, so in any case, these header files, they're really useful if you run into numbers here and you don't really know what they mean. So if Cinema comes back with this sort of response, or if you need to I don't know, call some specific function and you don't know the name for it, this is always a good place to start. Not only if you get this kind of number and you know specifically what to look for, but also if you just need some variable name and you really don't know what you're looking for. There's a good chance if you just jump around here and look for certain keywords that you end up with a good idea, at least, what it could be named. Like, let's say, if you're looking for rotate. There's so much stuff in here. Well, you get the idea. There's plenty of stuff in here. But, well, you're best off if you have a number to look for, because they are unique. So let's look back in Cinema here. As it said, that was a message from an icon, and yeah, you can see here it's actually coming from an icon. So let's click on our object and push a button here. Well, there's all kinds of stuff happening, and it's really way too much to handle. So what we are going to do is we're going to clear this, and we're going to use our filter. So we don't really want to see everything in here. What we want to see is this. Now let's start with the basic stuff. Let's just look at data. So let's say whenever we press a button, we want to see what the data package looks like. Okay, we need to reload first. Clean this up again. Okay, now we should have some peace and quiet. Yep, nothing's happening here anymore. Let's press one of these buttons. Aha, there we go. So now we see that that is a data package that's coming back from that message. You can see these curly brackets here. That means that the data package that's coming back is dictionary type. Meaning, well, if you're familiar with Python, which I hope, it's not just a list of these variables, but it's, well, a dictionary with ID being the identifier. So what we will do is we will look at ID by itself, which obviously should ideally just give us these 4 numbers. Right again. There you go. And this is just a list now. And we see 4 numbers here. And this one is really what's very interesting. This one here may look familiar to you because that's our plugin ID. So it's 1027967, And if we scroll up here, 102796. There we go. So we know this is coming from our plugin. And what's much more important is we look at this number here, 1004. Now, where's this coming from? Well, this is coming from our custom UI that we built for our plugin. And I promise you we will look into it, and that's what we're going to do now. So I'm actually commenting this out again. You can see the number here, by the way, already. And these are really the identifiers that we're looking for here. But how do we get there? And for that, we will use, let's see, do I still have it open? We'll use these two files here. So as I said before, this description folder holds your description for your user interface. User interfaces can be described in several ways. One way would be to create the user interface straight in your source code. That's a bit more advanced. Sometimes it's necessary, but oftentimes you don't have to. You can just use this specific format here, which is these two files together with this third string file. So these three files together create the user interface. Let me see, can I see them all together? Yeah, okay. By the way, if you're looking for a really good editor, have a look at Sublime Text too. Really good, I love it. So these are the three files that make up our user interface. Let's have a quick look at that again, just a reminder. So we have two columns here, one column with buttons, one column with checkboxes, and one link box where we can drag in other objects and then read out, well, data from that object. So to get this, we will use a specific description language that's being documented, well, not really well in this document here. And it's another reason why you really want the C++ one, because it's very well documented here. If you click on the user interface setting here right on or link right on the start page, it will give you a bunch of introductory data. And you should really look at it. But for us, we look straight at the dialog layout. And you can see here, this is how these dialogues are created. So yeah, it's just a text file. You can see that there's different layout options, how to align buttons, how to specify size, and here are all the different elements that you can put in your dialog. In our case, it would be checkboxes, buttons. So here's a checkbox, here's a button, and a link. Where's the link? Can't see it. Where's it gone? Interesting. It's not showing up in here, but it does exist. I can show you in a second. But let's have a quick look here, the button element. So there's really not much to it. There's a button, it will get an ID, and it can have certain flags. Yeah, but it doesn't have to. Okay, let's see what it looks like in real life. So I suggest you really look at the documentation. We will start with the main one, which is the resource file here. So container, that is the name. That has to be the same name as your files here. So all live capture now has to be exactly the same. Same here, by the way. Same thing. This one here is just always put it in there. ID object properties, that means it's in here. And you can see we have several groups and subgroups. So this is our main group. This is our groups don't show up graphically. They are just there to group elements together, which is very important if you want to have more than one column or row and all that. So in our case, we have a master group, we have a subgroup, and that subgroup is called a layout group, which means it's a special kind of group that can contain multiple columns. So that's just standing by itself, and then you can tell it how many columns you want. So in our case, 2 columns, and for each column you create another group. So automatically this is then column 1, column 2. And column 1 has our checkboxes. Our checkboxes are not called checkbox, but they're called bool, because they're basically Boolean values, on, off, or yes, no, depending, or true, false, however you want to call them. So just say bool and the name, bool and the name, bool and the name, and that's all you need. Same here, button and the name, button and the name. And then you have link and the name for the link. And that's all you need to create the basic layout of your UI. And you can just add your own buttons here if you want to play around with it. And these strings here then show up again in the string file and also in the header file. Now in the string file, you will associate each of them with a string in the language that you want to use for your plugin. Now we used strings US, but if it was strings.de, you would put in German strings here and so on. And based on the combination of this and this, you will then see like capture position in cinema. In cinema. Where is it? There. So that's a string coming from here. And the same identifier you will also see in the header file. Now this is very important. Every button or every object here has to show up here as well and has to get a unique number. So best thing is to start numbering it from top to bottom, and always from top to bottom. If you add stuff, just add it to the bottom and raise the number by 1. The order really doesn't make any difference. It doesn't have to be nice. Just make sure that it's always unique. You can't have any duplicates in there. And make sure that you start at least at number 1000. Don't go below 1000 because some system elements use those. You may even want to use 10,000 or something. As long as you're doing that, you should be safe. So these identifiers here, they show up again. No, where's my... Oh yeah, here's my... And we go back to single column layer. Okay, so these numbers show up here again. And you can just work with this here. I usually put just the entire file as it is here in here as well. It's so that if your program is longer, it becomes much more readable if instead of this here, I can just put in this. So who knows what the 1004 is, but this is definitely readable. So I know this is a button that was pushed. So to make this more readable, let's actually do this. And because these definitions are within the same file and not part of the C4D module, obviously you don't need to put in C4D in front. So these are just coming from here. These are global variables. So if you save this and we reload the plugin, this should still work just fine. Oh yeah, obviously I commented it out the print, so we can't see anything anymore. But it should still hopefully still work quite fine. So let's play this and select our cube. Just move it around a bit again. And how are we doing here? Yep, so it's still working. So this is still working fine. Okay, so back to the source code. Now we have caught the button, and like I said before, this was a list, and an ID gave us this information here, and the first of that information would be the ID of the button. So it's first counting at 0. This would be the first entry, and yeah, okay. Actually, I should probably show that to you, because let's say we do this. And where's my square bracket? There we go. Let's print that. Let's reload again. Oops. Reload. Push. Nothing's happening. Can't see anything here. It's not coming out. We would have expected a number, but instead, nothing. Let's try putting a string around it. Let's see what that does. There we go. So you see, it's not coming back as an integer that you would have expected, but it's coming back as a description object. And a description object, let's see what it consists of. Let's see. I think, can we just, not sure this works. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. So these description objects, they have several sub values like ID, description type, and creator. So where before we saw nothing here, let's try something else. Let's try look. So this gave us nothing. Let's try this. And while we're at it, let's try all the others. Type, create. Okay. Let's reload again. Push a button. There we go. Now these are, show you again. These are the values that we saw up here. So what that tells us is that ID is the ID of the button, 8 is the description type, and this was the creator, meaning our plugin ID here. So let's comment that out again because we don't need it. That means that if you want to check for the button ID, you always have to go through this here. So you have to go through the dictionary ID, then the first entry, and then the ID. And that gives you the button number. All right. So, and what we do is, then is we call a function, in our case, called flush tracks. We'll look at that in a second. Now, to actually call our functions when stuff happens with this cube here, we have to make sure that our object is doing something regularly without us having to click a button. So for that we use the draw function, which is being called every single time this screen is being drawn. And actually this screen is being drawn in several steps. So we don't want to have our object be called every single time something happens in the software, because it really doesn't have to. It's enough once per frame, really. So in our case, I just selected the object draw pass, which is one step in that draw sequence. And we say, okay, if the draw pass here equals this draw pass object, again, this is being this variable you find in the documentation. Let's quickly look there again. And the object data draw. There you go. These here, these are the steps. You just select one of them, and yeah. So if the draw pass is that pass, then OP, that's the object that's being drawn. In our case, our plugin or object plugin. So we have a look at this object and then look at this ID within that object. Now again, this is something that I defined up here. That's our position checkbox that's coming from the header files here in the where was it? It's gone there. See these here and here and here. So we check whether one of these checkboxes is checked, because none of these are checked. Like none of these record buttons are checked. We don't really want to do anything because there's really no point. So if none of these are checked, then nothing happens. Otherwise, if anything is checked, then we get the object from the link field, which is now O. O in our case points directly to the cube. And if this was empty, then O will be none, so O will be empty. Then again, do nothing. Otherwise, if O is something, in our case a cube, then we will get the cube's position, rotation, and scale, and pass it onto our setKey function. So far, these have all been functions that have been part of the object data class. Now we go to some functions that I wrote myself. These don't really have anything to do with creating a plugin anymore, but these are interesting insofar as they give you a good idea how animation works, or how animation is being stored within Cinema. The flush tracks one, that's well, just what it says. Let me just quickly show you what it does. So we have our object here, and we had something, well, before I played with the buttons, we had something recorded. Let's quickly record something again. Okay, stop. All right, so we have something recorded here, and let's say we want to get rid of it, then I click here, and it's gone. So the keys are gone, except the first one here, but generally this is now clean again. So that's what flush does. So to flush something, we look at the object, which again, the object was passed on by the message here. So in our case, I passed on the node that came in through the message. Node in that case was our plugin. So the plugin is being passed through here into the flush tracks one. And then I get all C tracks. C tracks are, well, okay, how to describe it? All animation within Cinema is being stored in tracks. So for each, let's say, position X, position Y, and position Z, each one of those has its own track. You can actually see that in Cinema when you click on one, click to animation, you can see add track or delete track and so on. And more interesting here, of course, with the coordinates. So these ones have animation on them. So if I go to animation, I can delete a track, copy a track, add a track, and so on. So this is the first layer, if you like. Each track then has in it a curve, which is actually this one here. So look at the timeline. If you look at this, these are the tracks, these are the curves. These are pretty flat here right now, but generally you know curves. And each curve in turn has keys. So if you want to store an animation in Cinema, you have to create a track, then you have to create a curve, and then you have to create a key. And then you continue to set keys wherever you need them. And conversely, if you want to get rid of keys, you have to flush them. So you have to find the track, first of all. In our case, we get all tracks here first. So this is returning a list of all the tracks that are out there for that object. And then I go through all of these tracks, and if I find a track that matches the description that I want to delete, in our case here the position ones, then I take the track, I get the track's curve, and I tell it to flush all the keys from that curve. And event add is actually, let me just go into this further in a second, but when I flush all the keys from this curve, that doesn't mean it deletes the curve or the track. Both of them are still there, it's just all the keys are gone. And event add is a bit special. What that does is it tells Cinema that something happened here. It doesn't really tell it what happened, but it tells Cinema that something happened and to refresh everything. This is really important because sometimes when you don't do that and you make changes, other parts of Cinema don't really know about these changes and start changing stuff from their end. And it can happen that they override something that you just set. So I just set a key, but some other plugin also tries to set a key. And if they both try it at the same time, it's just a matter of luck which one gets there first. If I make a change and I tell it to event add, then Cinema should refresh everything, and the other plugin should be aware of the change of the change that has been made, and everything should be golden. At least that's how I understand it. In any case, if you delete anything or add anything, it always makes sense to put in the event add. It's just if you do it too often, it can slow down Cinema a bit. But generally speaking, it's a very good thing to have. Yeah, and after the keys are gone, we just return. So this is rather simple. A tiny bit more complicated, but using the same principle, is set key, which is, well, just doing that really. It's creating a track if it doesn't exist, it's creating a curve if it doesn't exist, and it's creating a key. And if the key already exists, it just overrides it. So just like before, we get all the tracks that already exist. If there are no tracks, then we don't have to look for existing ones. Otherwise, go check whether there are position, rotation, and scale tracks already. If they do exist, again, we look at the details here, and if these numbers, for example, or these things here, they come from the 2 header files that I showed you before. So if you need to find something like this, this is a good place to look. So in any case, if we find a position track, we then put them into these variables here. Same for rotation and scale. So, and then if we are capturing something, then, well, again, we check if there is a, let's see, what am I doing here? Oh yeah, this is just, okay, if it has turned out that we didn't find a track up here, then we create a new track. For that, we create a blank track. Now this is really, you really have to look at the documentation to understand all of these here. Basically what it does is it creates a new track and then uses, it's just creating a track to store vector data, and it's creating vector x, y, and z for position x, y, and z. And then we add it into the object. But this is only if they didn't exist. If they already did exist, then we create a new key, and to that we take the track, the curve, and add the key. Usually you would think we would have to create our own curve, but when we create the track, there's automatically a curve being created as well. And we do this for rotation and scale as well. And that's basically it. Another thing is when you add a key, you have to tell it where to add the key. And at what time on the curve. And for that, we use a function here called docGetTime, which will give you the current time on the timeline in Cinema's base time format, which is some millisecond form. So this is always giving you the current time. And that is basically it. So what it does is it will go through the timeline, get the data from the cube, and for every frame just puts it into the curve. And that is all. Right. I know this was probably a bit chaotic because I haven't really prepared it. I was just making it up as I went along. But I still hope it gave you some good idea on how to get started playing around with these kind of things. Writing your own plugins, writing a tag plugin maybe, or an object plugin, which is quite useful to do stuff like this. If for some reason you need to record some other object, then yeah, there you go. this is basically doing a similar thing to the, what's it called, cappuccino, I think. Where's the function gone? There was some, I can't even remember. There was a function in Cinema that does a similar thing. You can just capture live action. But yeah, it's something to play around with. I will put a link in the notes to the source code of this. Probably going to be on the 908 lab site as well. If not, I'll put it somewhere else. But you will be able to get the source code and just use it as a starting point, so you don't have to type it from the screen grab. Yeah, if you have any questions, just put them in the comments. I will try to answer them. And until then, have fun. Cheers.